That morning, the courtroom was utterly silent. So quiet you could hear a pin drop. No one spoke, no one moved. Every eye was fixed on the heavy wooden door slowly creaking open, revealing a small, timid figure stepping inside. It was Lily Carter, just 5 years old, her tiny legs trembling in faded pink canvas shoes. But what truly drew everyone's attention was the creature walking beside her. A large German shepherd with dark fur and a deep scar running from its shoulder down its right flank. The dog's name was Buddy. Many in the courtroom had heard of him before. A former police dog, once hailed for charging into danger to save lives, then injured so severely he was nearly put down. Now he had returned, unexpectedly, to one of the city's most high-stakes trials. Lily hadn't spoken a word since the terrifying attack just weeks earlier, the same incident that had brought her here today. She was the only witness, the only person who had seen the attacker in the most critical moment. But her continued silence had left the case stalled, and now all hopes rested on something fragile, that Lily might, through a glance or a small gesture, identify the man who had tried to abduct her. Buddy walked close by Lily's side, each step measured and calm, as if sensing the emotional storm inside his young companion. As they neared the witness stand, Judge Mark Sullivan, a silver-haired man with a stern face who had presided over courtrooms for more than 2 decades, leaned slightly forward. His eyes were focused, but behind that intensity was something else, a quiet hope he barely dared to acknowledge. Sullivan understood this case wasn't just another legal proceeding, it was a tragedy, a real one, involving a little girl burdened with wounds far too deep for her age. On the defense bench sat Richard Hale, a 45-year-old software engineer with an intellectual air and a calm demeanor. He sat still, hands interlocked, eyes cold and unreadable. He had been arrested after an initial witness claimed to see him at the scene of the abduction. But there was no physical evidence, no confession, and the most important witness couldn't or wouldn't speak. Hale knew the odds were in his favor. His lawyer was prepared to argue that Lily's testimony was legally invalid. What he hadn't accounted for was the dog. And then it happened. As Lily sat on the witness stand, her eyes briefly flicked toward Richard Hale. No one noticed anything unusual, except Buddy, and maybe Judge Sullivan. Lily's hand trembled slightly, and with a tiny, almost imperceptible motion, she made a silent signal, something she had learned in non-verbal therapy sessions. Instantly, Buddy's demeanor changed. His calm posture shifted to high alert. Ears up, eyes sharp, and from deep in his throat came a low, rumbling growl, not a threat, but a recognition, as if he had just seen someone he knew was dangerous. Buddy's eyes locked on Richard Hale. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. The room shifted from silent to electric. A few people leaned back in their seats. Jurors whispered to one another. A reporter reached for the recorder. The defense attorney frowned. And then Judge Sullivan struck his gavel with a sharp, echoing crack that pulled everyone out of their stunned daze. 15-minute recess, he said, voice calm but carrying a warning. No one fully understood what had just happened, except Sullivan and Buddy. Something significant had entered the room in silence, and Sullivan knew the trial couldn't continue until he understood what it was. In the judge's seasoned eyes, the case had just taken a turn, and Buddy might be the key. As the final strike of Judge Sullivan's gavel echoed and the heavy courtroom doors closed behind them, a ripple of murmurs spread across the gallery, as if the room had just been jolted out of a trance by something invisible. People whispered about the dog's reaction, the little girl's glance, the strange but undeniable shift in the air. Something had happened, something unspoken, and yet everyone had felt it. But while the crowd wrestled with confusion, fear was already crystal clear just beyond the doors, in the shaking arms of a mother's embrace. Sarah Carter, still wearing the wrinkled pale blue dress from earlier that morning, knelt beside her daughter in the hallway, trying to steady her voice even as her body trembled. She gently stroked Lily's hair, whispering comfort that couldn't possibly reach the child's wounded heart. Lily said nothing, but her small hands clung tightly to Buddy's leash as if he were the last thing holding her world together. Buddy, still in his protective stance, sat close to her, eyes fixed on the door behind them, as if sensing something unresolved still waited on the other side. Across the hall, Special Agent Jack Monroe, dressed in a gray suit, his lined face weathered by years of chasing the worst of humanity, emerged from the investigator's room. His usual reserved expression now carried something sharper, more alert. He had followed this case from the beginning, seen the dead-end interviews, the exhausted psychologists, the failed leads. But what had just occurred in that courtroom? The way Buddy reacted had sparked a flicker of hope. It also triggered a gut feeling Monroe knew all too well from 3 decades of hunting child predators. Sometimes, it's the instincts of an animal that detect the truth more clearly than any human ever could. He looked over at Judge Sullivan, still standing motionless by the door, and said quietly, not as speculation but as a fact, "That dog recognized him." Sullivan didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, his calm blue eyes like a lake on the verge of a storm. He'd seen hundreds, maybe thousands of trials, but nothing had ever chilled him like the moment Buddy began to growl. It wasn't the sound. It was the look. That gaze wasn't something you could train into a dog. It was instinct, memory, recognition. And if Buddy truly recognized Richard Hale, then this trial was heading somewhere entirely new. Meanwhile, inside the defendant's waiting room, Richard Hale sat across from his attorney. Michael Graves, a tall, composed man with a practiced calm. But for the first time since his arrest, the cracks were starting to show. Hale sat upright, fingers laced tightly, those clean, slender hands, the hands of a man unaccustomed to trouble, now trembling, just enough for Graves to notice. "What the hell just happened in there?" Graves asked, voice low and tight. Hale didn't respond right away. He swallowed, closed his eyes for a second, and muttered, not as an answer but as if trying to reassure himself, "That dog, it knows something. It looked at me like it's seen me before somewhere I don't want to remember." Graves narrowed his eyes and leaned in. "What do you mean? Have you seen that dog before?" "No," Hale said quickly, then hesitated. "I don't think so. But that look, the way it stared like it could see through me." Graves didn't reply. He stared at Hale for a long moment, then rose and walked to the small window, cracking it open for air. The room felt heavier now. Not from heat, but from the realization that neither of them wanted to say aloud. This was no longer just a trial. This was a search for truth they might no longer be able to control. And for Hale, that truth was closing in, starting with the sharp eyes of a scarred dog and the eerie silence of a little girl. A silence he now wasn't sure would last much longer. And it was in that very moment, when fear began to seep into the edges of Hale's mind, that the memories returned, faint and fragmented, but sharp enough to haunt him. Like a distorted film reel playing in reverse, the images of that spring afternoon came flooding back, the day he nearly succeeded in taking an innocent child. It had been a gentle spring afternoon. Sunlight spilled across the backyard, golden beams filtering through the trees, swaying with the warm breeze. Lily, in a freshly washed pale pink dress her mother had just laid out for her, twirled joyfully among drifting dandelion seeds, her tiny feet chasing her own shadow, as if no danger in the world could ever reach her. She had no idea that just beyond the wooden fence, a pair of eyes had been watching her for days, cold, calculating, and obsessed with a sickness that had no name. Richard Hale was behind the wheel of a black van, parked less than 3 meters from Lily's back gate. His hand rested on a child's backpack printed with cartoon puppies, set on the passenger seat. Inside were some old toys, a few fake dog collars, and zip ties, all carefully chosen. Every step had been planned, every word rehearsed. To him, it was nothing more than a logic problem to be solved. When Sarah, Lily's mother, stepped inside to answer a phone call, Hale acted without hesitation. He stepped out of the van, adjusted his smile, smoothed his jacket, and silently slipped through the back gate like a familiar neighbor. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching to her eye level. His voice was gentle, unnervingly so. "I've got a few special puppies who need a little girl to play with. Would you like to meet them?" Lily, curious and naive as most children her age, tilted her head. Her gaze flickered between surprise and confusion. She didn't answer. She slowed her spinning, watching the strange man with the warm smile. But just as the silence stretched, a voice rang out across the street, sharp and commanding. It was Martha Jenkins, the elderly neighbor who lived alone, out walking her terrier. A retired pediatric nurse, she trusted her instincts, and what she saw didn't sit right. She yelled, her voice cutting through the peaceful afternoon like a siren. "Hey, get away from that little girl!" The moment shattered. Hale froze. The fake warmth in his eyes evaporated, replaced with something colder, sharper. His hand, which had gently touched Lily's wrist as if in play, suddenly tightened, but only for a heartbeat. Startled, he let go. Lily jerked back and ran, bolting toward the rear door just as her mother burst outside in panic. Sarah swept her daughter into her arms as the black van roared to life, tires screeching and leaving a trail of smoke as it vanished behind the row of houses. But what haunted Sarah more than the near loss of her child was the look Lily gave her as she turned, blank, dry-eyed, and silent, as if some small part of her had been swallowed whole by a nameless terror. From that moment on, Lily stopped laughing. She stopped speaking. She no longer called for her mother in the night. She simply clutched an old stuffed bear, her eyes distant and silent, as if the world had shut itself behind an invisible wall. And the worst part was, no one knew how to open that door again. No one, except perhaps a creature named Buddy, who, out there somewhere, had no idea that his own scarred past was about to become inseparably tied to the quiet wreckage of this little girl's life. Since that terrifying afternoon, it was as if an invisible door had slammed shut inside Lily's mind. A door that once opened to laughter, imagination, and the carefree world where a 5-year-old girl could exist in color and light. But now, the light was gone. Day by day, the Carter household grew quiet in the most unsettling way. No more tiny footsteps echo through the halls. No more questions like, "Mommy, why is the sky blue?" Or, "Daddy, can we talk about dragons tonight?" It was as if all of it had been swept away by a cold wind named fear. Lily, the once bubbly, wide-eyed child, had grown disturbingly silent. She no longer drew, though her small hands still remembered the feel of colored pencils. Sheets of blank paper lay untouched on her desk, a quiet memorial to the vibrant world that had once lived in her mind. Stuffed animals were neatly lined up on the shelf, like a farewell ceremony no one spoke of. The bunny-shaped pillow she used to carry everywhere now served only one purpose, something to clutch tightly on cold, quiet nights, when even breathing made no sound. And her eyes, once lit with curiosity, were now veiled in a fog, distant and unfocused, as if she wasn't seeing people anymore but simply looking through them. Sarah, Lily's mother, tried everything to bring her daughter back. She made Lily's favorite carrot soup, played the old children's songs that once sent her into fits of dancing, and retold beloved fairy tales in the silly voices that used to make Lily laugh until she fell over. But every attempt vanished into a void. Each failed effort left another crack in Sarah's heart, as if she were speaking to a shadow, just the shell of her daughter, while the soul had disappeared somewhere far, far away. David, the father who had always believed he had to be the strongest one, began to unravel quietly. He would sit in the car for hours in the mornings just to avoid stepping into the silence that filled the house. At night, he often woke to small sounds from Lily's room. The rustling of sheets, the fast breathing, the slight twitching of limbs. They were nightmares without screams, Battles Lily fought alone in her sleep, while her parents stood helpless outside, able only to hold her cold, trembling hands. After 3 weeks without a single word, gesture, or emotion, Sarah and David brought Lily to see a child psychologist. After careful observation and behavioral assessments, the doctor gave a quiet nod and delivered the diagnosis: selective mutism caused by acute trauma, a common condition in children after extreme emotional shock. But there was no guaranteed treatment plan. Every child, the doctor explained, is a maze, and finding the way out depends on patience, love, and a little bit of luck. Therapies were recommended: play therapy, art therapy, music therapy. But each seemed only to drive Lily further inward. During one session, she was given a drawing of a family and asked to color it. She silently rolled the crayon in her fingers, never touching the page, then set it down and stared into space, as if the people in the picture had nothing to do with her. Another time, she was invited to sit with other children building puzzles, but Lily didn't move, just sat there, still and distant, like a tiny statue carved from memory. The Carters' home sank into despair. Sarah began losing sleep, often crying quietly at night so David wouldn't hear. David, in turn, grew irritable and withdrawn, crushed by his helplessness. Conversations between them became rare and strained, as if both were drifting in a storm too vast to steer through. And in the middle of that storm was Lily, slowly fading before their eyes. Not physically, but in spirit, like a tender flower frozen mid-bloom in a winter too cruel to thaw, waiting for a miracle ray of sun that might never come. One moonless night, Sarah sat alone under the kitchen light, slowly turning a now cold cup of tea in her hands. Her eyes landed on a small pamphlet the psychologist had given her days earlier. Bold text across the top read, "Animal-assisted therapy, reconnecting through instinct and safety." At the center of the flyer was an image of a little girl hugging a large dog with kind eyes. Sarah gently placed her fingers on the photo. Something stirred in her, a small jolt, like a whisper from somewhere far away. And in that faint, distant whisper was the sound of hope. Fragile, yes, but maybe, just maybe, enough to start again. One late night, as Sarah sat in silence by the window, the moonlight casting a pale glow on Lily's restless face, she recalled a desperate piece of advice from a therapist. Try introducing an emotional support dog to the girl. Sometimes, what human hands cannot mend, the silent presence of a creature, one that speaks not in words but in heartbeat and unwavering loyalty, can heal. And that was when Buddy's name first entered their story. A dog seemingly forgotten by the world, but carrying a history powerful enough to reach wounded souls. Buddy was no ordinary dog. He had once been one of the most elite canine officers in the city's police force, a four-legged warrior who had never hesitated to throw himself into danger to protect the innocent. 3 years ago, during a high-stakes operation to rescue kidnapped children from an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, Buddy, then just 4 years old, was the lead asset in the raid team. In the most critical moment, when a criminal suddenly grabbed a child and held a knife to his throat, Buddy did not wait for an order. With lightning speed, he lunged, sinking his teeth into the attacker's arm and bringing him to the ground, saving the child from the blade by mere inches. But in that very moment of heroism, the criminal managed to pull out a hidden dagger and slash at Buddy, a deep wound that cut through muscle, leaving a long scar running from his shoulder down his right flank. The dog collapsed at the scene, lying in a pool of his blood. Although he survived after hours of surgery, the injury left Buddy with impaired mobility in his hind legs. The once effortless training drills, attack maneuvers, pursuits, and rapid responses became painful and sluggish. With budget cuts affecting the K-9 unit, the police department could no longer afford long-term rehabilitation. Buddy was deemed unfit for service and placed on the euthanasia list, a cold, bureaucratic decision that made no room for the sacrifices or loyalty that had once saved human lives. Once the pride of the force, Buddy now lay motionless in the veterinary control center, his eyes no longer burning with purpose but clouded with quiet sorrow, as if he understood that the world he had fought to protect was now closing in on him. But just when fate seemed sealed, a woman stepped in and changed Buddy's destiny. Dr. Laura Bennett, an animal psychologist and director of a canine-assisted therapy program for traumatized children. When she learned Buddy's story, she did not see a broken animal. She saw a soul still capable of understanding, still brimming with loyalty, still possessing the instinct to protect. For nearly 2 months, she fought through layers of red tape to adopt Buddy, defying objections from all sides. She believed that if placed in the right environment, Buddy would not only survive, he would help others survive, especially children trapped in nightmares like Lily's. And so, on a gentle March afternoon, at a special rehabilitation center run by Laura, a silent girl with hollow eyes and a scarred dog met for the first time. 2 souls fractured by the darkness of humanity, yet perhaps 2 pieces that could bring each other back to the light. As if fate had arranged it with quiet intention, that afternoon, sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows of the rehabilitation center, where the scent of antiseptic mingled with the gentle warmth of animals. Sarah Carter held her daughter's hand as they stepped into the hushed space, where even the air seemed carefully muted to protect the fragile souls within. Lily walked slowly, her small shoes barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes moved quietly across the room. She looked like a shadow, present, but not fully alive, as if she were viewing the world through a thick pane of glass only she could see from the inside. In the far corner, bathed in soft golden light pooling across the floor, sat Buddy. Calm, majestic, not threatening. His large body was still, his deep brown eyes following Lily's every movement, yet he didn't budge an inch. He simply watched. Dr. Laura Bennett knelt gently beside Lily, her voice low and warm, as though speaking directly to fear itself. "You don't have to do anything. Buddy won't come near you unless you want him to. You can just look or stand here as long as you like. No one will make you do anything." There was no reply, only the faintest nod, barely perceptible to anyone except Laura and Sarah. But it was enough. It meant that Lily was listening, that somewhere, deep inside, she was still there. Laura turned to Buddy and gave a simple hand signal. "Stay." The former police dog remained completely motionless, not even a twitch. His ears subtly tilted in Lily's direction, but his gaze stayed calm and steady, as though waiting for an invisible cue, the same way he had done countless times in dangerous missions before. Minutes passed in absolute silence. The room seemed frozen in place, and then, without prompting, without a word, Lily let go of her mother's hand and took a slow step forward. Then another, and another. Each small step was like walking across thin ice, delicate but determined, fueled by a bravery far beyond her 5 years. When she was just an arm's length away from Buddy, she stopped. Both Sarah and Laura held their breath. Then came the moment no one expected. Lily's tiny hand, trembling yet steady, began to rise. Her thin fingers reached out slowly, inching toward the thick fur between Buddy's ears, and finally, they touched. Barely a brush, a feather-light contact. But she didn't pull away. In that instant, something unseen seemed to pass through the room. A silent current, subtle but undeniable. Buddy gently tilted his head, his warm breath settling into the small palm before him. And Lily kept her hand there. It wasn't just a touch. It was a beginning. The first time Lily had reached out to anyone, to anything, since the attempted abduction. The first time she allowed herself to trust another living soul. The first flicker of light in the long, dark room where she had been hiding for weeks. Sarah placed a hand over her heart as tears welled and fell before she could stop them. Laura smiled, not with triumph, but with the quiet awe of someone who knew they had just witnessed something rare, something sacred. Buddy didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply lowered his head a little closer to the trembling hand, as if bowing in acknowledgement. And in that seemingly ordinary moment, a bond formed, silent but strong, between two wounded souls who had just recognized each other, not with words, but through presence alone. Since that first silent meeting, the bond between Lily and Buddy began to grow in a way no other therapy had managed. Not through words, not through adult reasoning, but through breath, footsteps, and the quiet presence of a dog who had once bled for the lives of the innocent. Each afternoon, Lily returned to the therapy center with her mother, where she would sit beside Buddy for hours, gently stroking the thick fur around his scar, as if her tiny fingers were reading an untold story, every ridge in the scar a chapter about pain, courage, and survival against the odds. Then, something no one expected happened. After nearly a month of complete silence, Lily began to draw again. At first, they were nothing more than aimless scribbles in crayon, but soon clearer images began to emerge. A wooden cabin in the forest, towering trees forming living walls, a black van on a dirt road, and most notably, a figure of a man with a dark red teardrop-shaped birthmark on his neck, which Lily consistently colored in with reddish-brown every time he appeared. Sarah sensed something unsettling, but didn't question her daughter. Instead, she quietly kept each drawing and showed them to Dr. Laura Bennett. With her sharp, clinical intuition, Laura saw the significance immediately. The details in Lily's drawings were not random. They were consistent, deliberate, not distorted by imagination. It was as if Lily's mind had taken mental photographs and was now replaying them frame by frame. Laura began to monitor the drawings closely, and what stunned her was the precision. The wooden cabin always had the same shattered window on the left. The van always tilted slightly as if one wheel had sunk into a ditch. The man with the birthmark, though crudely sketched, always stood in the same position. It wasn't fantasy. It was memory. Laura started forming a hypothesis that Lily might possess a rare kind of visual memory, eidetic memory, or possibly hyperthymesia tied to trauma, a condition in which a child retains scenes and sensory details like photographic records, especially when linked to emotional shock. If true, this wouldn't just support Lily's psychological recovery. It could be the key to unlocking the truth about the mysterious cabin, the black van, and the man with the teardrop mark. Things that had seemed like figments of a broken child's imagination were now aligning disturbingly with reality. Then came the moment that shook Laura to her core. While reviewing old case files, she came across a photo buried deep in a sealed record of a suspect investigated years ago, someone once associated with Richard Hale. In the photo, on the side of the man's neck, was the unmistakable mark, a dark, teardrop-shaped birthmark. It was the emergence of these drawings and Lily's steady behavioral recovery that led Judge Mark Sullivan, who had been quietly observing the therapy progress, to make a rare, unprecedented decision. Buddy would be allowed to remain beside Lily for the duration of the trial, not as a symbol, not as an emotional crutch, but as a critical component of her communication and well-being. The ruling sparked immediate controversy, especially when the first session of the reopened trial began. The courtroom was packed, with reporters, legal professionals, and curious onlookers. That morning, Lily entered the courtroom in a soft, ivory dress, clutching Buddy's leash tightly in her hand. All eyes turned toward her, not only with sympathy but with something else, a strange feeling in the air, as if something beyond legal norms had stepped into the room with her. Michael Graves, attorney for the defendant, Richard Hale, stood immediately. His tone was polite but firm, his voice even and confident. "Your Honor, while we respect the unique needs of the witness, the presence of a large shepherd dog in the courtroom is entirely inappropriate. It risks emotionally influencing the jury and could create an unfair impression of danger linked to my client." He glanced at Buddy, who sat still, eyes fixed on Hale. Not aggressive, but piercing, observant, deep enough to make one feel as though being seen through to the bone. Judge Sullivan did not respond right away. He placed a hand on his chin, carefully reviewing the file in front of him. After a moment, he turned a page bearing a certified psychologist's stamp, then looked up. His voice was calm but resolute. The court has reviewed expert opinions from the attending therapist, a certified animal handler, and a child trauma specialist. This dog is not a prop. He is an essential part of the witness's ability to communicate. As such, Buddy will remain in the courtroom whenever Lily is present. A wave of murmurs passed through the room. Some scoffed under their breath, but no one openly objected after that firm ruling. Graves pressed his lips into a tight line and returned to his seat, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. Beside him, Hale remained composed, but his right hand twitched ever so slightly when he heard the name Buddy. And then, something shifted. Without command, Buddy let out a low, deep growl. It was barely audible, but the entire room went still. It wasn't hostile. It was a signal, a statement, an instinctual assertion of presence. And what chilled everyone was this. Buddy only growled when Richard Hale looked at Lily. It happened again and again, every time Hale's gaze found its way to her, even just a glance. Buddy reacted. Ears perked, jaws tightened. The low rumble rose from his chest, as if no words were needed to identify the threat before him. It wasn't evidence, not in the legal sense, but it was real. Unmistakable. No one could fake that. No one could train a dog to respond like that without reason. And as the silence returned, heavier than before, a new thought began to take root. Not just in the jury, not just among the spectators, but even in Judge Sullivan himself. What if that dog was seeing what none of them were yet ready to face? In that tense, wire-tight atmosphere, with every gaze focused on the scarred dog with strange instincts, it was Lily's turn to be called to the witness stand. The little girl, her hand still gripping Buddy's leash, was gently led to the seat by her mother. She sat down, her small body swallowed by the high wooden chair, her legs dangling without touching the floor. Her face showed no expression, but her eyes quietly scanned every person, every detail in the large courtroom. Judge Sullivan gave a slight nod to Prosecutor Jenna Collins, signaling that she could begin. Jenna, with the caution of someone experienced in working with child witnesses, stepped forward, her voice gentle but clear. "Hi, Lily. I know you're very brave to be here today. I'm not asking you to speak. If you feel safe, you can nod or point. I have only one question. Do you recognize the man who approached you that day?" Lily didn't respond right away. She looked down at the floor, then glanced at Buddy, who was sitting quietly by her feet, as still as a statue, yet his eyes never left Hale, who sat upright, arms crossed, wearing his usual detached expression. And then, something no one in the courtroom expected happened. Lily slowly raised her small arm, trembling slightly but unwavering, and pointed directly at the defendant, Richard Hale, her tiny finger extending like a silent accusation heavy with meaning. Not a single word was spoken, but at that moment no language was needed. The entire room understood. The little girl had identified the man who had stolen her voice and her sleep for weeks. Before defense attorney Graves could rise to object, Lily made another small gesture, so subtle that many nearly missed it. A special hand sign, precisely the one she had been taught during her therapy sessions with Buddy, reserved for situations of distress. And immediately, Buddy shifted. His ears perked up, his muscles tensed. A low, deep growl rumbled from his throat, not aggressive, but instinctive and full of warning, like a sound echoing from a cave. It was the same response he had given when he first entered the courtroom. The parallel was uncanny, so exact that anyone who had previously doubted Buddy's initial reaction now fell into silence. Richard Hale tried to maintain his calm, but the corner of his mouth twitched, and his eyes, usually as still as water, wavered when the girl's finger pointed straight at him. In the public gallery, some gasped. A murmur rose, The jurors began scribbling notes faster. Jenna Collins opened her mouth to continue the questioning, but Judge Sullivan raised his hand to stop her. His eyes stayed fixed on Buddy, who had now returned to sit beside Lily, but whose body remained taut, alert, his gaze locked on Hale, as if tracking every breath. "This court is in recess," Sullivan declared firmly, striking the gavel once more. But this time he did not leave the bench right away. Inside his mind, a rush of questions flooded in. Why had Buddy reacted like that? Had the dog met Hale before? And if so, under what circumstances? A new thread had just emerged, and he knew, if he followed it to the end, he might uncover something they had all missed. A part of the truth that only a girl who couldn't speak and a dog who couldn't lie could bring into the light. The heavy silence that had blanketed the courtroom after Judge Sullivan's gavel strike had barely begun to settle when the hurried footsteps of Prosecutor Jenna Collins echoed down the dimly lit hallway behind the scenes. In her hand, she clutched a copy of the drawing Lily had made, the image of a forest cabin with a familiar black van. No longer a childlike detail, it now stood as a potential piece of real evidence. At the same time, at the FBI's Forensic Crime Lab, the results of the soil analysis from Hale's tire treads were just finalized. Among the dirt and dried mud was a specific type of moss fiber, endemic only to the northern forest region of the state, an area where a long-abandoned campsite had once stood over a decade ago. Jack Monroe, with over 30 years of experience investigating disappearances, felt his heart race in a way that only happened when a lead turned real. In his hands were the case file and Lily's drawing, where the cabin was sketched with a precise crack on the roof, an eerie match to recent satellite images of the forest site they had just pinpointed. He had no doubt anymore. The child wasn't imagining things. She was recounting something she had seen with her own eyes. The very next morning, a special operations team was deployed to the target area, led by Monroe and Agent Lisa Grant. This time, Buddy was brought along, no longer just a symbol of therapy, but an active member of the investigation. The vehicle rumbled along a winding dirt road into the remote woods, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight could only filter through as faint streaks across the dense forest floor. The moment the vehicle stopped, Buddy transformed, shifting from relaxed to full alert. His ears perked, nostrils flared, body leaning forward as if pulled by something invisible. No command was needed. He leaped from the car on his own, leading the team through a tangled wall of vegetation, across knee-high overgrowth, until a decaying cabin emerged in a clearing. Small, shadowed, and untouched for a long time. But what sent a chill down Monroe's spine wasn't the abandoned exterior. It was the fresh boot prints stamped into the damp earth and the scent of recently disturbed wood. Buddy gave a soft growl, began circling the cabin, then abruptly barked twice, stopping at a corner where the ground dipped slightly. Monroe knelt and tapped the wooden floor with a metal rod, and the hollow echo confirmed his instinct. Beneath the cabin was a space, a hidden basement. They pried up the floorboards one by one. Flashlights beamed into the darkness below, revealing a narrow staircase descending into an air thick with rot. Weapons ready, the team moved down slowly, hearts pounding. And there, in the farthest corner of the low-ceilinged basement, barely illuminated by the weak light, was a thin girl with tangled hair and tattered clothes, curled up and shackled by old wire to a wooden post. "Oh God, Emma!" Monroe choked out, rushing forward after confirming the name on the faded plastic bracelet around her wrist. Emma Sullivan, the 8-year-old who had been missing for 6 months and presumed dead. The girl looked up, her vacant eyes slowly regaining focus as she registered the presence of people. And as if recognizing she was finally being rescued, her lips trembled, and she whispered hoarsely, "Help me." And as if summoned by that raw, instinctive emotion, Buddy, restrained at the top of the stairs, let out a desperate whine, straining to push past the narrow opening to get to her. When Emma was carried out in Monroe's arms, She said nothing more. She simply clutched the coat wrapped around her as if it were her last protection. But her eyes never left Buddy. Eyes that held no fear, only primal gratitude, as though it had been the dog's breath that had rekindled something in her the darkness had nearly extinguished. And when the news of Emma's survival reached the courthouse, Judge Sullivan, quietly reviewing files in his office, dropped his pen onto the desk. His gaze locked on Lily's drawing of the cabin pinned to the board. Now he understood. This case was not just a single kidnapping. It was a thread in something deeper, darker, and he now knew, without question, that it was Lily and Buddy, not anyone else, who were charting the path toward the truth. The moment Emma Sullivan was pulled from the cold, dark basement beneath the cabin and wrapped in a thin blanket on the ambulance stretcher, one of the younger agents bent down to reassure her. But Emma didn't respond. She simply clutched the man's hand with every last ounce of her fading strength. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just whispered through cracked lips. There was a man birthmark back of the neck, shaped like a teardrop. The fragmented words hit with the weight of 1,000 bricks. Agent Lisa Grant immediately locked eyes with Monroe. That description, a teardrop-shaped birthmark on the back of the neck, was the exact detail Lily Carter had drawn over and over in her pictures. A detail once dismissed as a child's imagined trauma response now had real-world confirmation from a second victim. And with it, the entire scope of the investigation shifted. After receiving fluids and rest at the medical center, Emma was approached carefully by child psychologists. Miraculously, she wasn't shut down the way Lily had been. Instead, it was as if she had been holding on to her memories for 6 long months in the dark, waiting for someone to listen. Slowly, with a raspy but steady voice, she began to recount the places she had been held. The sounds of cars passing on forest roads at night, the twang of old country music from a battered radio in the second cabin, and the face of the man with the sharp eyes, always hiding his neck under a low hat, but who once turned just enough to reveal a dark red mark, like a drop of blood at the base of his neck. Emma also described a middle-aged blonde woman who brought cold food and fake smiles, often whispering to her, "You'll have a new family soon. Just be patient." That sentence sent chills down Monroe and Lisa's spines. Not only had Emma been kidnapped, but she had been prepped for handover. This wasn't the work of a lone predator. It hinted at something more. A child trafficking network, hiding in plain sight, operating behind the clean image of people like Richard Hale, a single, well-paid software engineer with no criminal record, a spotless financial history, and a perfectly ordinary life. That very night, the FBI reopened 4 unsolved child abduction cases from the past 2 years, all girls aged 6 to 9, all vanished near homes or playgrounds, all with eerily similar circumstances. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, just the occasional mention of an old black van with chipped rear paint seen near the scene. One file from a neighboring state had documented a man with a neck birthmark, once detained near an elementary school for suspicious behavior, but released after 24 hours for lack of evidence. That man? A former college acquaintance of Richard Hale. And so, a hidden thread began to unspool, connecting names no one expected, locations once thought unrelated, and details once dismissed as random. Emma couldn't recall specific addresses, but she vividly remembered the first cabin's teal-colored walls, a round window, and a worn map stuck to the fridge door with red markings. She had spent hours staring at that map, not knowing why, but unknowingly memorizing the placement of the red dots. Under the guidance of her therapist, Emma drew the map from memory. Monroe felt the breath leave his lungs when they cross-referenced it with real-world geography. 3 of the 4 marked points matched known abduction sites. The 4th? A remote vacation home, secretly owned by a shell company, in which Richard Hale was the primary shareholder. The horrifying truth came into focus. Hale hadn't merely happened to be near Lily's abduction. He was potentially a central coordinator in a trafficking network, an unassuming monster who used his tech expertise, clean persona, and total emotional detachment to orchestrate disappearances and cover his tracks. But what gutted Monroe most was realizing this. Buddy, the dog who had sniffed Hale's clothes, who growled each time Lily made a gesture, had known all along. And if someone had only trusted the instincts of a creature who couldn't speak, they might have found the truth months sooner. Now, with Emma's testimony, Lily's drawings, and Buddy's unwavering behavior, the final piece of the puzzle was beginning to lock into place. But that also meant one terrifying thing. If this was truly a network, Hale wasn't acting alone. Others were still out there, watching, waiting, ready to disappear or strike again. And the next trial wouldn't just be a case against one man. It would be a battle for justice, for the children who were taken, for the ones still missing, and for those whose voices had been silenced before they ever had a chance to be heard. Just when the puzzle seemed to be coming together, when the investigation team could almost taste the justice closing in on the monster behind it all, a new player entered the game. No grand introduction, no dramatic entrance, but from the very first moment he stepped into the room, the energy shifted. Owen Ramsey, a federal officer assigned from the Interstate Anti-Trafficking Division, he was introduced as a special resource, someone with experience cracking complex child abduction cases. He arrived at the strategic meeting like a high-value chess piece being placed on the board. With neatly cropped hair, a calm demeanor, and a case record thicker than some department heads, he left little room for doubt. On paper, at least. From the start, Jack Monroe, the lead investigator, maintained cautious neutrality, a habit formed over decades of reading people. Owen was courteous, quiet, and efficient. He carried his laptop, offered to take the lead on financial audits tied to Hale's business connections, and promised to track digital breadcrumbs that might reveal collaborators. But by the third day, Monroe began sensing something too smooth. Every time a file was requested, Owen politely deflected. The data was not yet verified, under encryption, or awaiting clearance. He was the first in the office each day, and the last to leave. Always alone in the data lab. Lights off, face lit only by the cold glow of his screen. Then came the moment Monroe couldn't ignore. During their second operations meeting with Owen present, Buddy, who had been lying quietly beside Lily in the next room, suddenly shot up. 3 short barks, a low growl. When the door opened and Owen entered, Buddy changed completely. Body tense, hackles raised, paws planted firm. His eyes locked onto Owen as if he were staring down danger itself. Dr. Laura Bennett, who had been with Buddy from the start, had never seen him react that violently, not even to Richard Hale. She gave the usual command to calm him, but Buddy didn't budge. He growled, low and steady, until everyone in the room had stopped talking and turned to look. And in that silence, no one could deny it. There was something deeply wrong. Monroe didn't make accusations. Not yet. But he started watching more closely. During a follow-up trace on suspicious transfers between Hale's company and an anonymous Texas account, Owen claimed nothing significant had turned up. But days later, another team member stumbled across that same account and found it had wired money to a derelict property Emma had described in her testimony. When Monroe asked Owen to explain, he just shrugged, smiled faintly, and blamed it on a systems glitch. It might have fooled someone else, but not a man who'd hunted predators for 30 years. What disturbed Monroe more was Owen's grip on information. Every new data point, Owen filtered first. Always offered summaries, never full reports. Documents sent to Judge Sullivan were consistently trimmed down. And most alarmingly, Owen had never once attended interviews with witnesses or victims, not even once. Lisa Grant joked, "He's like a shadow, shows up, scribbles something, then vanishes." But Monroe knew. Shadows were where the worst things hid. Then, one late night, Monroe returned to the office to retrieve an old USB, and saw a light glowing under the door to the data room. He stepped quietly to the threshold and cracked it open. Owen was there, standing over a printer, stacking satellite maps, personal records, and images of Lily Carter. He placed them into a separate folder, carefully, methodically. None of it had gone through the main system. There were no logs, no oversight. The next morning, Monroe called an emergency meeting with just two people, Dr. Laura Bennett and Agent Lisa Grant. He laid everything out, then said the one thing none of them had dared consider. We may have a snake in our pocket. If Owen Ramsey was planted inside the task force, meant to misdirect, suppress, and shield those behind Hale, then everything they'd built was at risk. The truth, the victims, even the people still fighting for them. Somewhere down the hall, Buddy still sat beside Lily, silent, still, but his eyes hadn't left the door Owen had walked through that morning. And if a dog who'd nearly died once could still smell the dark, the real question was, would the humans be brave enough to follow his lead before another child vanished without a sound? As suspicion around Owen Ramsey thickened like fog around the investigation team, deep in the quiet of a dimly lit restroom, Buddy lay curled at Lily's feet, resting but watchful. Nearby, Dr. Laura Bennett sat alone by the window, her fingers gently brushing the worn spine of an old case file, one few remembered anymore. The file belonged to Lieutenant Andrew Keller, the only partner Buddy had ever truly bonded with, as if he were part of the dog's own heart. 3 years earlier, the department had been rocked by a case that left scars. A 7-year-old girl named Olivia had vanished after school. No witnesses, no trace, just a blurry security camera still showing a silver van parked near a public park, then disappearing. At the time, Buddy was in peak form, an elite K-9 officer, having helped break drug rings, intercept smugglers, and track down armed fugitives. But this was his first child abduction case. His handler? A sharp, idealistic young officer named Keller. For 2 agonizing weeks, they searched. No one knew their trail would lead them to an abandoned sawmill on the outskirts of town, where an old basement had been converted into a holding cell. When the task force finally closed in, they were short on backup. Keller and Buddy decided to go in first through a back window, trying to seize the only chance to save the child. But the kidnapper was no ordinary criminal. He was a trafficker trained in foreign military combat, with booby traps and brutal reflexes. As soon as Keller stepped inside, the man lunged from a blind corner, knife in hand, like a ghost out of the dark. Buddy didn't wait for a command. He launched forward like a bolt of lightning, clamping down on the attacker's arm and forcing him to drop the blade. But not before that blade slashed deep into Buddy's flank. Nearly 20 centimeters, the wound bleeding like an open faucet. Keller rushed to free Olivia, who was bound to a rusted pipe. But as he untied the last knot, the man returned and stabbed Keller directly in the chest. Right before Buddy's eyes, the man he trusted most fell like a felled tree. And in that moment of grief and fury, Buddy kept fighting. Bleeding, shaking but relentless, growling, lunging, biting, until the backup team arrived and took the man down. Buddy survived 6 hours of surgery and 2 months of recovery. But he was never the same. The lightning-fast K-9 became quiet, meditative, changed. But in that change, Laura noticed something else awaken, an uncanny instinct, a kind of predator detection no science could explain. Over the next year, Buddy began working with child trauma victims. And again, he reacted, sharply, unmistakably, around adults who avoided eye contact, who masked guilt too well for most people to notice. Not trained to attack, Buddy would simply freeze, eyes fixed, body tense, and release a low, steady growl from his chest. And in nearly every case, those people were later found to have a history of abuse. Or worse. Laura remembered one day at an orphanage. A security guard bent down to pet Buddy. The dog recoiled, growled, and stepped back. People brushed it off. But months later, that man was arrested for abusing 2 boys. From that moment on, Buddy wasn't just a therapy dog. He was a silent protector, a guardian of children with no voice, a survivor carrying the pain and memory of a fallen partner who stood his ground where others faltered. And now, as Laura watched Buddy react to Owen with that same frozen stare and bone-deep growl, she knew. That scent, that presence, it was the same as the men who had left blood on Buddy's teeth. She didn't need a warrant. She didn't need a confession. Because one thing had always held. A dog cannot lie. And sometimes, a growl is the most honest accusation the world will ever hear. While the memory of Lieutenant Keller's sacrifice remained fresh in Laura's mind, a constant reminder that darkness often wears the most familiar face, it was Buddy's instinct, forged in blood, pain, and loyalty, that ultimately led the investigative team to a door no one had dared to open. Based on the increasingly suspicious behavior of Owen, the fragmented but consistent testimony from Emma, and the uncanny overlap between Lily's drawings and the map she recreated from memory, Monroe made a decisive move. He gathered every piece of data and fed it into a high-priority analysis system, using artificial intelligence to trace connections between property records, financial transactions, and vehicle GPS data. The results left the team stunned. What appeared on the screen wasn't a list of a few remote houses or scattered cabins. It was a vast network, stretching across more than 11 states, with at least 27 known or suspected locations tied to previous disappearances. These sites included cabins, roadside motels, discrete parking lots, and highway-adjacent warehouses. They all had something in common: proximity to major interstates, minimal surveillance, and easy access for quick entry and exit. Richard Hale, once believed to be central, was now identified as a minor link in a much larger chain. His job had been to receive the children and direct them to transit points. Each transfer was treated like a shipment, hidden under the guise of business trips, freight deliveries, or even legal logistics operations. What froze the room in a single breath was the name found at the top of the command structure: Jeffrey Langston, a billionaire, a celebrated philanthropist, a man praised on magazine covers for his humanitarian work, and founder of an international child welfare organization that claimed to rescue orphans, when in reality, it was the perfect mask for a child trafficking network that had been operating for more than a decade. Beneath his spotless public image was a web of shell companies, anonymous accounts, and a roster of planted collaborators, including social workers, police officers, school security staff, and even admin personnel within major global aid groups. The FBI immediately issued a national arrest warrant and coordinated with Interpol to investigate Langston's operations worldwide. Early evidence, routed money through offshore tax havens, satellite imagery matching known victim locations, confirmed what the team feared most. This network didn't stop at the borders of the United States. It likely connected with international trafficking syndicates. Meanwhile, Richard Hale was interrogated again. He stayed silent at first, face as blank as ever. But when he was shown photographs of additional transfer sites and the medical files of children who had vanished permanently, his composure finally cracked. And then came the final blow. Buddy was led into the room. When Hale saw the scarred dog, its steady golden brown eyes locked directly on him, he recoiled. He cursed aloud, turned his head and bit his lip until it bled. Monroe didn't need further proof. That kind of fear couldn't be faked. Hale began to talk, not because he regretted what he'd done, but because he knew that if the network went down, those higher up would erase all traces, including him. He admitted that the cabin Lily had drawn was a waiting station, a location where abducted children were assessed for transfer suitability before being sold in black market auctions hosted on the dark web. The ones who didn't meet the criteria were disposed of. That was the word he used. And the moment he said it, the room went dead quiet. In all his years of chasing predators in the dark, Monroe had never felt such fury rise in him. But his voice remained level as he gave the order. "Send the full file to the federal court. We're not just arresting Hale, we're bringing down the entire network. From the drawings of a silent girl, from the instincts of a dog that couldn't speak, from marks on maps and fragments of memory once brushed aside. The truth behind a massive, horrific crime was finally beginning to emerge. But they all knew. The arrest warrants were only the beginning. The real war, the one that would bring justice to the stolen and the silenced, was only just beginning. As news of the massive child trafficking network led by Jeffrey Langston spread within federal agencies, a chilling awareness began to settle over the task force. Everyone understood that when a predator feels cornered, it strikes back like a wounded animal, and the first counterattack didn't take long. Just 2 days after Richard Hale confessed, and the full map of the trafficking network was laid bare, Special Agent Lisa Grant, one of the most active members of the tracing team, became the first target. It was an overcast day with sharp winds sweeping across the western highway outside the city. Lisa was conducting an off-grid investigation, following up on an abandoned warehouse once linked to a missing truck reported in a child disappearance case the previous year. No one knew that her route had been leaked, and even fewer suspected that Owen Ramsey, the colleague who seemed so helpful, was the one who silently tipped off the other side. Lisa drove alone in her black FBI-issued SUV, carrying copies of Emma's drawings and GPS data from the cabin where the girl had been held. She hoped to find something concrete, evidence that could help build a case against Langston. But the moment she stepped into the desolate warehouse yard, surrounded by rusted containers and derelict machinery, the air shifted. Something was wrong. Danger crept in before she had a chance to prepare. A soft noise cracked behind her. Instinctively, Lisa drew her weapon and spun around, but too late. A figure lunged from behind a stack of crates, striking her hard in the shoulder with the butt of a rifle. She collapsed, her vision swimming. Dazed but trained, she rolled aside, dodging a boot aimed at her ribs, and scrambled to find cover. The attacker was no amateur. Tall, masked, and fast, he moved with calculated precision, navigating the warehouse like he knew it inside and out. He didn't shoot, which meant he wanted her alive, for interrogation or leverage. Lisa took a blow to the stomach and fell back, her gun clattering from her grip. She reached for her tactical knife, but was slammed against the wall. Everything began to blur. Then, just as her knees buckled, a bark ripped through the air, sharp and fierce, like a siren of justice. Out of the shadows between shipping containers, Buddy surged forward like a storm unleashed. His amber eyes locked onto the attacker, body low and fast, his presence a blur of fury and precision. With a snarl, he leapt and sank his jaws into the assailant's arm. Blood sprayed. The man howled, flailing to shake him off, but Buddy held on, growling, relentless, as though in that moment he saw Keller again, falling, dying. And this time, he would not let history repeat itself. The attacker stumbled backward, tripping on a metal shard, nearly losing his footing. He slashed wildly with a knife, cutting deep into Buddy's ear. The dog yelped, pulled back, but didn't retreat. Lisa, gasping for air, seized the moment. She grabbed her sidearm and fired. One shot missed, but the second hit the attacker in the leg. He screamed, dropped a small cylindrical object, likely a smoke grenade, and hurled it to the ground. The room flooded with thick white fog. By the time the haze cleared, he had vanished through a back exit like a ghost. Coughing and bloodied, Buddy and Lisa staggered as backup arrived. A red trail marked the floor from Buddy's wound, but the dog stood tall, tense, staring at the exit as if ready to chase him down. Lisa dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around Buddy's neck, trembling but grateful beyond words. She pressed her forehead to his, still warm with life and courage, and whispered like she was thanking an old friend she'd never properly acknowledged. "If it weren't for you, I'd be gone." From that day on, no one at the office referred to Buddy as just a therapy dog. Even Monroe ordered an official ID badge printed for him, marked K9, Buddy, position, field intuition. It made him, in every sense, a full member of the team. And Lisa, the once data-driven, steel-nerved agent, became the first to ask, before any mission, did Buddy react? The ambush sent a message the entire team understood. Langston and his allies weren't just powerful and wealthy. They were ruthless, unbound by rules, and willing to strike at the task force's most vulnerable points. But this time, they had chosen the wrong target and the wrong dog. Because Buddy wasn't just part of the investigation anymore. He had become a symbol of instinct, loyalty, and a justice that couldn't be trained and couldn't be fooled. Just as the team was beginning to catch its breath after Lisa's near-death ambush, lingering suspicions of betrayal from within, once only silent gut feelings, erupted into a full-blown storm that tore through what little trust remained. Owen Ramsey, the man once praised as a human trafficking expert, the one who worked side by side with Monroe to piece together the case, was officially exposed as a traitor. A snake that had slithered its way into the heart of the investigation from the very beginning. After the failed hit on Lisa, the tech division uncovered a sequence of signals transmitted from an internal device, traced to a hidden virtual network embedded deep within an encrypted system, accessible only by someone with high-level clearance. Monroe ordered a review of internal surveillance footage, and what they found was damning. A clip of Owen sneaking into the evidence room, removing an external hard drive containing satellite images of the second cabin, believed to have once held 3 children, and later incinerating it in the waste processing basement. The video showed him in a black cap and mask, but the most telling detail was his left wrist, which he rubbed absently, where a round scar matched a description from a past witness who spoke of a man with a strange mark on his wrist, who always smelled faintly of mint. The truth was undeniable. Owen was the man who had monitored the cabin where Emma was held. He was the one who leaked protection routes, the insider connecting Langston's syndicate to law enforcement. But the worst was still to come. When discovered, Owen didn't run. Instead, he made a final, desperate move: eliminate the most important witness, Lily Carter. That night, as a storm gathered above the city, Lily and her mother were inside a secured safe house, protected by a rapid response team and constant surveillance. But Owen, armed with administrator access and intimate knowledge of the security system, disabled key sections for a full 15 minutes, enough time to slip in undetected. Dressed in a black raincoat, hood up, he scaled the rear fence using a rope tethered from the eaves, moving like a shadow. Lily was asleep on the second floor. Her mother, Sarah, had just turned off the light and stepped into the hallway when she heard a faint rustle behind her. She turned. Nothing. Assuming it was wind, she walked away, unaware that a killer had entered the house, carrying a syringe filled with a dose strong enough to stop a child's heart without leaving a trace. But Lily wasn't alone in that room. Though still recovering from the battle that saved Lisa, Buddy lay at the foot of her bed. The moment those unfamiliar footsteps crept closer, his dark brown eyes snapped open. That wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Monroe. And the scent in the air, chemicals and betrayal. The door creaks open. A figure moved inside, silent, inching towards the bed. The syringe was ready. But just as he raised his arm, Buddy unleashed a feral snarl and launched. The attacker crashed to the floor, the syringe shattering. Glass shards slicing into his wrist. Blood spurted. He kicked, landing a blow to Buddy's chest that hurled the dog against the wall. But Buddy didn't stay down. Shaking, he lunged again, teeth sinking into the man's shoulder, tearing through the raincoat to reveal pale skin, and beneath it, a tattoo linked to a known syndicate monitored by the FBI. The scream that followed sent Sarah running. She froze when she saw Owen, his face twisted with rage, hovering over Lily, now wielding a dagger pulled from his boot. But Buddy, for the third time, threw himself between the blade and the child, taking a deep gash to the side. Blood sprayed, soaking the white bedsheets. Lily's eyes flew open, terrified. And from the depths of silence, a voice finally broke free. "Don't hurt Buddy!" The scream tore through the house, through the storm, and through the long months of silence. The response team burst in, Owen was dragged from the room, thrashing and howling, no longer a cop, no longer a teammate, just a monster in a stolen uniform, stripped bare by the courage he never understood. Buddy was rushed to emergency care, bleeding heavily but still alive. Lily clung to him, face buried in his blood-matted fur, crying for the first time in months. No one dared interrupt that moment, because they knew. The bond between Lily and Buddy was no longer about therapy or protection. It was something deeper. A friendship between two wounded souls who had fought back against evil and survived together. That rainy night, with ambulance sirens howling through the streets, a new truth was written in blood. The mole had been unmasked, but something else was born. True courage. And it had teeth. When Owen was arrested during that blood-soaked night, with undeniable evidence of betrayal and an attempted assassination of Lily, it seemed, for a moment, like the darkness had been pushed back. But Monroe, who had lived through too many close calls to ever relax, knew better. This was only the tip of the iceberg. The real battle was just beginning. From the fragmented statements Owen left behind, spoken between pain, desperation, and spite, the investigation team uncovered a far more terrifying truth. Owen was not acting alone. He was just one of at least 5 plants embedded across law enforcement agencies throughout the country, tasked with sabotaging investigations, misdirecting intelligence, and silencing key witnesses when necessary. And their #1 target was still Lily Carter. There was no time to wait for trial or further legal motions. That very night, Federal Judge Sullivan signed off on an unprecedented witness protection order, something he had done only twice in his entire 30-year career. Under this order, Lily and her mother, Sarah Carter, were relocated to a top-security safe house, completely cut off from civilian infrastructure. No GPS, no internet, no traditional communication methods. The location was a remote cabin deep in a mountain range within a national forest, previously used by the military for climate research. It was now surrounded by layered sensors, infrared cameras, drones, and a rotating detail of elite agents. All of this to protect one 5-year-old girl and a dog with a long scar down his side. Even the relocation order was encrypted. Sarah was given just 10 minutes' notice before the armored vehicle arrived. Throughout the overnight journey on winding mountain roads, Lily lay curled against her mother's chest. Buddy lay between them, his head resting on the girl's lap, his eyes unblinking. No one spoke much, but everyone in that vehicle understood that the silence wasn't peace. It was the quiet before a storm still gathering on the horizon. At the safe house, life took on a quiet, contained rhythm. Lily had her own, with a window facing the vast green forest. She began drawing again, this time with color, light, and images of trees, a house, and always Buddy by her side. Outwardly, everything looked calm. But inside the security team, tension stretched tight, because Jeffrey Langston was still out there. According to the latest financial intel, Langston had converted all of his assets into cryptocurrency and begun removing himself from any traceable company links. A villa in Switzerland, emptied of furniture in under 12 hours. A luxury apartment in Dubai, transferred to a shell corporation. Even more alarming, Interpol intercepted chatter about a new auction of children being planned on the dark web, despite the syndicate's recent exposure. It was proof that Langston never intended to flee. He was reorganizing. And he wanted Lily silenced before she could take the stand. Monroe gathered the team in a sealed room. Maps blanketed the table. Escape routes, defense strategies, and Lily's protection schedule were plotted down to the hour. But even he knew that every defense has blind spots. No one could say who the next threat might be. A delivery person? A fake nurse? A coin-sized surveillance device? Sarah, terrified but steady, held her daughter's hand tightly. She had once been an ordinary mother, reading bedtime stories and planning birthday parties. Now she was the mother of a federal witness, someone who had once fled her home in the middle of the night to escape a killer. But she never asked to leave. She never asked for it to end. She had only one request. Let me stay with her. And keep Buddy close. That was the one thing the FBI didn't need to debate. Even Monroe, who had once dismissed the idea of canine instinct, now refused to let Buddy stray more than 5 meters from Lily's side. 1 week after the attack, an observation post logged a report of an unidentified flying object hovering above the forest for 38 seconds at a height of 42 meters before disappearing. No devices picked up a signal. Was it a stealth drone? A surveillance probe? No one could say for sure. But with Langston, anything could be a weapon. And Lily was still a target. Despite the intense protection, the threat had never really left. The invisible arms of a criminal empire were still reaching, still watching, following the breath of a child. And in that silent forest, Lily, though young, was beginning to understand that her life would never be what it once was. It may never go back. But when she looked at Buddy, still lying there, eyelids half shut but ears twitching at every soft noise, she knew one thing for certain. She was not alone. The front line was no longer inside a courtroom. It lay beneath the trees, in every quiet second that passed. And that 5-year-old girl, along with her scarred, 4-legged companion, had become the only light left in a darkness that was still closing in. While every layer of protection was tightening around Lily and her mother inside a top-secret forest hideout, and while surveillance equipment monitored every strange signal outside the perimeter, in the heart of the city, a different kind of storm was building, silent but seismic. Inside a courtroom under maximum security, it began with a man once known for his cold, unshakable composure, Richard Hale. The same man who nearly handed Lily to monsters, who scoffed at the law and smirked when exposed, now entered the courtroom looking like a ghost of himself. His eyes were sunken, lost, and trembling. Gone was the crisply pressed suit. Gone was the arrogance. What remained was a hollow man, eroded by the nightmare he helped build, and by the terrifying truth he could no longer ignore. If he stayed silent, he wouldn't survive long enough to be sentenced. Prosecutor Jenna Collins, sharp and composed as ever, opened with a question that cut like ice. "You've begun to tell the truth, Mr. Hale. Now continue. Tell the court who is behind all of this." A heavy silence fell. Hale looked up. His lips tightened before he finally uttered a name, or rather, a single letter. "I don't know his real name. He's always called L, just the first letter." The room froze. That letter, L, had appeared before, buried in encrypted files and leaked documents from within the trafficking ring. Now it had a voice confirming it. Hale swallowed hard and continued, each word sounding like it cost him a piece of himself. "I never met him face to face. Instructions came through non-networked devices, USBs encrypted with dual-layer locks. But I know he's close. He controls everything, like a spider at the center of the web." From the back of the courtroom, Monroe's brow furrowed. It confirmed what he'd long suspected but could never prove. Langston wasn't running things directly. He was orchestrating from the shadows, as if he didn't truly exist. "But there's something you need to find," Hale said quietly. "An old warehouse, south edge of the city, near the industrial zone once owned by one of Langston's subsidiaries, Argentum Holdings. It was abandoned 3 years ago, but I'm certain it's where he stores the backup files, original records, all the things he's too afraid to put online. Names, photos, videos, client lists, transaction logs, everything." The courtroom held its breath. Jenna stepped closer, her voice lower now. "Why reveal this now?" Hale closed his eyes for a moment. "Because I know I'm no longer useful to him. Owen was a warning. Next time it could be me. And if I die, then at least that sick system dies with me." Judge Sullivan, known for his steady demeanor, slammed his pen against the table for the first time. "If physical evidence exists, this court will authorize a warrant before the day is out. But mark my words, Mr. Hale, if this is a diversion, you won't just be convicted for kidnapping. You'll be tried for obstructing federal justice." "I'm not bargaining," Hale whispered, eyes empty. "I just don't want to be killed like an animal in a cage." Within 30 minutes, a search warrant was signed. Monroe personally led the tactical team, which included tech specialists, bomb disposal experts, and Lisa Grant. Her shoulder still stitched, but her will unshaken. Buddy, though still recovering, was brought to the perimeter of the warehouse. His ability to detect movement and unfamiliar scents was something no piece of equipment could replicate. Back in the forest hideout, Lily knew nothing about the courtroom confession that could shift the entire case. She sat by the window, drawing again. This time, her picture showed a dimly lit room, filled with filing cabinets, cast in red light, with two silhouettes, one large, one small, standing in front of a half-open door. When Dr. Laura Bennett saw it, she froze. The red light, exactly the color used in high-security data vaults to indicate lockdown mode. Lily couldn't explain why she drew it. She simply said, "I dreamed someone was about to open the snake's secret box." In that moment, across 3 separate locations, Laura, Sarah, and Monroe all felt the same thing. This was no longer a standard investigation. It was a race against someone who had never let anyone get close. With Hale's testimony, the final door was about to open. But what lay beyond it? No one could say for sure, whether it would be light or a deeper abyss than anyone had ever imagined. When the words National Pediatric Center, Internal Case Files Dr. Marcus Bell lit up under a flashlight in the basement of the forgotten warehouse, time seemed to stop. Every breath in the room slowed, suspended in a thick, unnameable wave of shock, fury, disbelief, and collapse. No one on the task force could have imagined that after so many twisted leads and detours, the man behind the entire chain of monstrous crimes was someone revered nationwide. A pediatrician once seen as a symbol of compassion. Dr. Marcus Bell. His name had graced medical honor rolls, government health advisory panels, and global humanitarian missions in Africa and Southeast Asia. He had won awards for his work with vulnerable children. And yet, here his name was, on the cover page of a horrifying document, where each child's medical case was labeled in bold, signed by his hand, and marked with classifications like eligible for Phase 2, Target Group A+. Not just 1 or 2, but hundreds of files. Diagnoses ranged from colds and developmental delays to ADHD, each categorized, coded, and forwarded through a system disturbingly similar to product shipping. Lisa Grant felt her throat close as she flipped through the files. In one folder labeled Transfer Week 32, she found the name Emma Sullivan, the same girl rescued only weeks earlier from a hidden cabin. Her photo was attached to a CT brain scan and a behavioral report. At the bottom, Dr. Bell had signed and written a chilling note. Psychologically stable, neutral social response, suitable for limited communication placement. The words were clinical, polished, yet carried a coldness that made Lisa want to vomit. "He used charity as a hunting blind," Monroe said, his voice low, eyes reddening with rage. "Langston was the logistics man, but Bell, he picked the targets, tagged the kids, turned them into medical commodities." In the corner of the room, Buddy had been sniffing silently, his nose guiding him through the darkness. He stopped suddenly at a heavy safe tucked into the shadows and let out a low, tense growl. The lockpick team moved in, cracking the safe in 18 tense minutes. Inside was a dual encrypted hard drive, a world map marked with trafficking routes, and most damning of all, a black leather-bound notebook. Lisa opened it, and her pulse stalled. The first page read, "Clinical Notes for Marcus's Eyes Only." Beneath it was a list of prominent names, politicians, CEOs, wealthy donors, each tagged with unique symbols and notes rating their cooperation, discretion, financial yield. In other words, it was a client list. Some names had numbers, some were blank, but every one of them was enough to shatter public trust on a national scale. "This isn't a case anymore," Monroe whispered. "It's a system, an empire, and we just punched a hole straight into its heart." He immediately ordered the entire scene sealed. Transport planes were called in to carry every piece of evidence to a high-security FBI archive. All hard drives were cloned 3 times, each copy stored in a separate encrypted facility. Physical documents were scanned, backed up, and locked in fireproof containers. Buddy was escorted by 2 agents and never left the team's side until the operation ended. As for Marcus Bell, just hours after the arrest warrant was issued, security cameras at LaGuardia Airport captured him boarding a private jet to Turkey, traveling under a false passport with the name Henry Boyd. What he didn't know was that the very notebook he meticulously designed contained a clue Monroe had noticed: an apartment address in Montreal, once used as a medical file drop site. An international task force was immediately deployed to Canada, while border security systems were placed on high alert. But more than anything, all eyes were now turning to the upcoming trial, where Lily Carter would officially take the stand, and her testimony might be the final blow that collapses the entire network. Back in the safe house, Lily had never heard the name Marcus Bell, but that night she had another dream. In the morning, she drew a strange picture: a man in a white coat standing in a dark room under a yellow bulb. He was looking down, holding a doll. Beside him, Buddy was snarling, eyes blazing with fire. Laura Bennett, upon seeing the drawing, said quietly, "She doesn't need to know his name. Her soul already feels who the enemy is." And so, the final chapter of the fight began. The veil had been lifted, and Buddy and Lily, once victims, had become 2 flickering lights now piercing the darkest corner America had ever dared to confront. As the warehouse files were sealed and Marcus Bell's name rose to the top of international most wanted lists, the trial of Richard Hale entered its final day in the Capitol under a soft, steady rain. The nation held its breath. This wasn't just another high-profile case. It was the end of a long, brutal battle, and the world was watching, because Lily Carter, the little girl who had survived an attempted abduction, was about to testify. She was the last living witness, the only person who had looked her attacker in the eyes, and her voice could bring an entire criminal empire crashing down. Lily sat in the front row, flanked by her mother, Sarah, federal security officers, and most notably, Buddy, the service dog, now bandaged and still healing after taking a blade to protect Lily during the forest ambush, rested beside her. His wound hadn't fully closed, but when Lily looked at him with quiet concern, he gently wagged his tail and rested his head on her foot, as if to say, "I'm still here." Judge Mark Sullivan struck his gavel 3 times. The room fell silent, each breath drawn in and held as though the air itself waited. He looked toward the defense table, where Richard Hale stood with his head lowered, face pale, stripped of the arrogance that once defined his every move. "With overwhelming evidence presented to this court," Sullivan began, his voice steady and resounding, "including testimony from primary witness Lily Carter, physical evidence retrieved from multiple crime scenes, and the indirect confession of the accused, this court hereby sentences Richard Hale to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the attempted abduction of a minor, conspiracy with an international human trafficking network, and obstruction of federal justice." The courtroom exhaled, a wave of relief and finality washing over the crowd. It felt like the end. Justice delivered at last. But no one, absolutely no one, could have predicted what would happen next. As a court officer approached to take Hale into custody, he suddenly spun around and grabbed the officer's sidearm. The motion was swift, practiced, deadly. A scream tore through the courtroom. "Gun!" Just as Hale raised the weapon and pointed it directly at Lily, who froze, her wide eyes too stunned to process what was happening. For a single, stretched-out second, time stopped. And then, Buddy leapt. Without a command, without waiting for anyone to act, the dog let out a deep growl and launched himself like a living bullet toward the little girl, placing his body between her and Richard Hale at the very moment the gun fired. The courtroom froze in horror. The only sound that followed was a sickening thud, the impact of Buddy's body hitting the marble floor, blood spilling in a widening red pool, staining the white tile beneath the witness chair. A scream tore through the air, sharp, raw, and heart-wrenching. For the first time in months of silence, Lily found her voice. "Don't leave me!" It was Lily, her first words, and the most painful ones. Her cry echoed like thunder in a storm, cutting straight into the hearts of everyone present. No one could deny the pain she had endured. No one could sit still after witnessing a loyal creature throw itself in front of a bullet for the child it loved. Police officers swarmed Hale, pinning him to the ground as he thrashed like a cornered animal. Meanwhile, Lily rushed to Buddy's side, collapsing over him, her small hands trembling as they touched his blood-soaked fur. Sarah screamed and ran to her daughter, wrapping her in a desperate embrace, sobbing. But Lily kept repeating the same heart-breaking words. "Buddy, don't sleep, Mommy. Buddy's sleeping. Tell him to wake up." No one dared to speak. No one dared to break the silence, for fear that doing so would make it real, would confirm what they all feared most. But Buddy wasn't gone. His breath was still there, shallow but present. Emergency medics rushed in, lifted him onto a stretcher. And as they carried him out, Buddy opened his eyes one last time, glanced at Lily, gave a faint wag of his tail, then slipped into unconsciousness. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It had become a storm of emotion, a place where justice, pain, love, and life collided in a moment no one could ever forget. Reporters, broadcasters, child advocacy groups, millions watching live. Everyone wept. For a dog, for a little girl, and for a single sentence, so simple yet powerful enough to shake the conscience of the world. "Don't leave me." It wasn't just a cry for help. It was the voice of hope, paid for in blood, loyalty, and courage that no human or animal should ever be asked to summon. But Buddy did, without hesitation. And from that day forward, in the history of American justice, no courtroom would ever be remembered not for its verdict, but for the fall of a voiceless warrior who gave everything to protect the voice of a child. As the emergency doors closed behind the medical team carrying Buddy's bloodied body, the courtroom, where justice had just been served and where violence had so suddenly erupted, fell into a silence so profound it didn't feel like fear. It felt sacred. Everyone, judges, attorneys, agents, even journalists who had written hundreds of articles about crime, stood frozen. They couldn't speak. They couldn't move. It was as if the world had been emptied of sound, leaving only the trembling cries of a little girl who had finally found her voice after months of silence. Lily Carter, age 5. The child whose voice had been stolen by trauma, who once clung to her mother's side like a shadow, who had looked at the world with haunted eyes, was now sobbing. Her cry wasn't loud, but it came in waves, fractured yet rhythmic, carrying breath, carrying life. She cried as if her tiny heart could no longer contain the pain it had been forced to store, as if all the emotion locked behind her ribs had cracked open, spilling out in tears, gasps, and trembling words. "Buddy, don't leave me. Buddy, please don't go." Her voice, so fragile yet clear as it echoed through the chamber, meant for legal reasoning and restraint, cut straight to the core. A security officer turned away to hide his tears. A young prosecutor lowered her head, her shoulders shaking. Even Judge Sullivan, who had presided over hundreds of solemn trials, stood silent, one hand pressed to his chest, as if trying to hold together something breaking inside him. Sarah, Lily's mother, collapsed to her knees, wrapping her shaking arms around her daughter's small frame. The woman who had fought relentlessly for her silent child now cried like a child herself, whispering into Lily's ear, "You spoke, baby. You called for me. You came back to me. I heard you, sweetheart." In that moment, time itself seemed to pause. The trial, the verdicts, the files and testimonies, all of it shrank before the honest cry of a child for the dog that had saved her life. Dr. Laura Bennett stood frozen in the back row, both hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She had once fought to save Buddy from being euthanized. She had placed her faith in the connection between Buddy and Lily when no other therapy had worked. She had believed in science, in psychology, in method, but now she understood. Healing sometimes comes through love, a force no manual or model can replicate. And in the eyes of everyone present, one truth became clear. Lily's silence had finally, completely shattered. Not because of therapy sessions or carefully crafted questions, not because of court pressure or clinical strategy, but because of one wordless act of sacrifice, because a dog had thrown itself in front of a bullet, because its final look said, "No one will ever hurt you again." This wasn't just a moment of breaking silence. It was the purest testimony of love, the kind evil could never reach. Lily kept crying. Her sobs were broken, but her words were forming now, shaped by breath and courage. And for the first time since the attempted abduction, she began to speak. Not just one phrase, but sentences that poured from a storm long trapped inside. "I remember Buddy. I saw him jump and then fall with the blood. I thought he'd never wake up again, Mommy." Sarah didn't reply. She only held her tighter, letting the tears come freely. No one else tried to hide their emotions anymore. The courtroom, once a place for composure, had become a sanctuary for human feeling. And as Lily's tears softened, as her breathing slowed, she reached for her mother's hand and said quietly, "I want to tell everyone about Buddy, from the beginning, so they know he saved me, over and over." At that moment, everyone understood. Lily Carter, once too afraid to speak, had chosen to become a storyteller, not just to tell Buddy's story, but to speak for all the children whose voices had never been heard. The silence had broken, and from the ashes of the nightmare, a small voice had risen, one that might just become the light leading others toward justice. After that agonizing scream, one that marked not just pain, but a new beginning for Lily. And after the courtroom held its breath and then burst into tears, a breaking news alert came from the military medical center. Buddy, the heroic K9, had survived the critical surgery and was officially out of danger. The news spread like a wave of emotion across online headlines, national broadcasts, pet communities, and child psychology forums. Buddy was no longer just a dog. He had become a living symbol of loyalty, courage, and the sacred bond between a child and an animal. Veterinarians who took part in the surgery confirmed the bullet had torn through soft tissue, severely damaging his chest and part of his shoulder. The operation lasted 5 hours, with top specialists flown in, including a former special ops field surgeon. Buddy's heart weakened throughout the procedure. But each time the monitor flatlined, a nurse whispered "Lily" into his ear. And miraculously, the numbers climbed back up. When the surgery finally ended, Buddy was moved to intensive care in a semi-conscious state. The lead surgeon told reporters, moved to tears, "We've seen loyal dogs before, but never one that fought this hard to stay alive, just for a child." When Lily heard the news, she stayed quiet for a long time. Then, silently, she drew a picture. A dog resting beneath a tree, with a little girl sitting beside him reading a book. Underneath it, in shaky but heartfelt handwriting, she wrote, "You don't need to be a police dog anymore, because now you're my family." Doctors confirmed that Buddy would never fully recover. Nerve damage meant he could no longer perform the rigorous duties of a working K9. But he was alert, eating, able to walk, and most importantly, his eyes still lit up when he heard Lily's name. So, a decision was made. After recovery, Buddy would retire permanently into the Carter home, where his heart had always belonged. There was no grand ceremony, just a quiet medal presentation in the hospital courtyard. A silver tag was clipped to Buddy's collar, engraved with a simple line, "Buddy, silent warrior, guardian of the first voice." The most touching moment came when Lily walked forward in a beige wool dress, her hair tied with a red ribbon and a bouquet of wild daisies she had picked from behind the hospital. She knelt, placed the flowers beside Buddy, and whispered, "You did the hard part. Now it's my turn." From that day on, Lily joined Dr. Laura Bennett's Canine Therapy program, not as a patient, but as a storyteller. She spoke to other children about Buddy, about that first hug, about the silence, and how it wasn't broken by words, but by someone simply sitting next to her and not walking away. With each session, Lily drew another picture of Buddy, of herself, and of children who had never been heard. The media swarmed with requests, documentaries, books, and interviews. But Lily didn't care for cameras. She just wanted to sit beside Buddy, read books, or tell stories to children like she once was, with the hope that, if a dog can make me feel safe, maybe a story I tell can help someone else start to speak. And so Buddy, though retired from the force, continued his final mission: to be the gentle light guiding a generation of children who deserve to be loved and heard. From the small town where the Carters lived to classrooms far and wide, the image of the girl and her hero dog became more than just a symbol of a landmark case. It became a symbol of healing, a reminder that even if you've once been silent, afraid, or broken to the core, there will always be someone, human or not, willing to sit with you and wait for you to speak your very first word. The image of Lily embracing Buddy during the quiet medal ceremony spread across every corner of the media. The entire nation seemed to agree on one thing: the little girl once swallowed by darkness had truly returned to the light, and her voice had become the echo of a miraculous journey. But what no one expected was that she wouldn't just find her voice. She chose to turn her story into a guiding light for other children. Children who had experienced pain, silence, and the feeling of being completely misunderstood. Dr. Laura Bennett's therapy dog program, once a small center for severe trauma cases, suddenly became the heart of a national initiative. With funding from both the Department of Health and Education, the center began to scale, reaching more children than ever. As professionals, psychologists, and child protection groups rushed to build programs and frameworks, it wasn't the technical reports or expert panels that moved people most. It was the quiet, steady presence of Lily, who joined the program not as a patient, but as its most special storyteller. No one made her do it. It was Lily herself who asked Laura, "I want to tell everything for the kids who still can't talk." Like I couldn't. Once terrified of strangers' eyes, Lily now sat calmly in front of the camera, neat in a soft gray knit dress, her hair tied to one side, one hand always resting gently on Buddy's head like an anchor. During the debut broadcast of Listening Without Words, aired live on the National Education Channel, Lily needed no script, no prompting. She smiled, nodded, then turned to Buddy, now older and slower but still sharp-eyed, and spoke slowly, clearly, as if the whole world had finally stopped to listen. He understood me even when I couldn't say anything. The studio fell silent. The stillness wasn't sad. It was reverent, as though someone had quietly placed a hand over every heart in the room. Letters poured in afterward. Parents wrote in saying their children nodded for the first time after hearing Lily speak. A single mother shared that her non-verbal autistic son had reached out and touched the TV screen, whispering, "Dog, friend," his first spoken words in weeks. Lily's storytelling didn't stop at the camera. She, her mother Sarah, and Dr. Laura began traveling to hospitals, special schools, and centers for abused children. Whenever Lily entered a room filled with quiet kids, eyes wary or lost, she didn't rush. She'd sit, place her storybook on the table, filled with drawings, colored paper, pictures of Buddy, and careful handwriting, and begin with the same line. "Once, I couldn't talk. Then I met a dog, and he never waited for me to say anything." Her stories weren't fairy tales. They were real, full of blood, tears, pain, and healing. She spoke of the forest cabin, of Buddy's first growl, of the courtroom, and the scream that broke the silence. But she spoke as a survivor, not a victim, and that's what allowed even the quietest children to look at her with a glimmer of hope. Because if a little girl who once couldn't say a word could now stand and tell her story, maybe one day they could too. Buddy, now older and slower, didn't run much anymore, but he still went everywhere with Lily. even just lying under her chair, wagging his tail now and then, or resting his head on her lap. He continued sending an unspoken message. That unwavering presence could be the key to trust. Researchers began calling it the buddy effect, the phenomenon where animals help children heal trauma through nonverbal understanding. And Lily, with her calm eyes and steady voice, never claimed to be special. In a year-end interview, she said, "I'm not a doctor. I'm not a teacher. I'm just a kid who used to be sad. And now I tell stories so other kids know they're not alone." Therapy sessions continued. More stories were shared each week. Children who once stayed silent began to draw, to write, to whisper names to stuffed animals, or murmur their first shy words. And at the center, people still saw a little girl sitting beside an old dog, flipping open a worn notebook and starting a new page. Today, I'll keep telling the story. And so the healing, sparked by one deep growl, continued, word by word, drawing by drawing, eye to eye. A voice once silenced now gently guides others toward their own. As the stage lights dimmed after the final episode of Listening Without Words, Lily gently closed her worn, memory-filled notebook and turned to gently stroke Buddy's head. He was noticeably older now, slower, quieter, but his eyes were still soft, still warm, still him. Somewhere far from that small studio, the people who had silently witnessed her journey were also reflecting on everything they'd seen unfold. In a study lined with dusty books and faded medals, retired Judge Mark Sullivan sat at his desk, holding a lukewarm cup of tea. Among the plaques and framed photos on his wall, one image was framed more carefully than the rest. A drawing Lily had sent him for his 70th birthday. In it, a small girl stood in the darkness, holding the leash of a scarred dog, Buddy, facing the unknown. No words were written. Only a faint glow of light surrounded the pair, as if their bond alone was enough to cut through the dark. Mark looked at the drawing, nodded slightly, his eyes wet but warm. He had ruled over cases that haunted him for years. But Lily's case, the one where a voiceless child redefined justice, was never one of them. Because he knew, sometimes what makes justice feel real isn't the law itself, but the moment a voice finally breaks the silence. A voice like hers, crying out in pain and truth. "Don't leave me." Up in the northern countryside, Jack Monroe, now retired from the FBI, spent his days tending to a modest garden, reading the paper, and quietly following Lily's journey through every broadcast. Inside a small wooden box on a shelf, he kept tokens from that case. An old case file, a photo of the forest cabin, and Buddy's retired K-9 badge. Lily had handed it to him herself at a private ceremony, along with a simple note written in shaky handwriting. "You keep it because if it weren't for you, I would have never met Buddy." Monroe had seen things. Unsolved cases. Children never found. Voices that never came back. But Lily had not only survived. She had become the voice for those still waiting to be heard. And Monroe knew then. He didn't need to carry a gun anymore. He didn't need to hunt shadows. Because kids like Lily were now the ones guarding hope. In one of his rare TV appearances, when asked about the most unforgettable moment of his career, Monroe said, "It wasn't when we breached the cabin. Not when we uncovered the mastermind. It was when I heard that little girl call out to her dog, with the most broken, human voice I've ever heard. That was the sound of life." Back at the therapy center where it all began, Dr. Laura Bennett, now leading a team of dozens and overseeing hundreds of patients, still reserved a special seat at every new program. She called it the first seat, and whenever asked why, she simply smiled. "I once saved a dog no one believed in. That dog saved a child, and that child went on to save countless others." Buddy, after so many years beside Lily, had grown old. He moved slowly, slept more often. But whenever Lily entered a room, no matter how quietly, his eyes would open, tracking her with the same steady gaze. He could no longer protect her physically, nor growl warnings, but he was still her anchor. Through presence, memory, and a heart that once shielded her entire world. On the first ever National Animal Assisted Therapy Day, among all the photos and tributes shared, one image stood above the rest. Lily, now 10, sitting on a small wooden stage, resting her hand gently on Buddy's head, her eyes looking out over a quiet group of children. She smiled and began, "Once there was a dog who couldn't talk, and a girl who couldn't speak, but they still understood each other. No one needed to hear the rest. Everyone already knew where the story was going, because this was a journey of trust, a reminder that even when the world walks away, someone's eyes might still stay. It was a story of courage, not the kind with armor, but the kind that doesn't run when someone needs you most. And it was proof of a love without words, a love that could heal even the most broken souls." On the cover of the book chronicling the entire journey, a book titled, "In the Silence, I Heard Everything," one single line was printed in white on black. "Not all heroes wear badges, some have 4 legs." And so, the story ends. Not with a full stop, but with a gentle nod. A nod to the things still ongoing. Friendship, healing, and the first brave words yet to be spoken. This was the story of Lily and Buddy, a little girl silenced by trauma, and a dog once deemed useless after injury. They didn't just save each other. Together they wrote a healing journey that moved an entire nation. What do you think helped Lily finally find her voice? Was it friendship, courage, or the silent understanding only Buddy could offer? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear them. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more voices can be heard. Thank you for being here. And remember, true love doesn't always need words.